Okay, good evening. Really glad to join you this evening. Obviously, a little different format this year, but like I just mentioned, we're going to have some plenty of time for discussion, questions. So the main thing I would like to emphasize is that please, as you have any comments or questions as we go along this evening, please go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll get to those later. And obviously, during the question session also, please try to just unmute and ask questions as well. So we want to leave plenty of time for that. We'll keep the presentations a little bit shorter and focus on some key aspects. And then, of course, again, leave that time for questions. And so when it comes to fertility management, like I say, we want to keep these two presentations a little bit more focused. So this evening, I would like to discuss a little bit more nitrogen, which is typically, of course, the main limiting nutrients for us in Kansas. We do have some recent work looking at potassium in corn as well, and so we have some data from last year I'd like to share with you. And there's a lot of discussion also about soil pH and lime, especially no-till systems. So I will touch a little bit on that, and as well as other limiting nutrients in the time that we have this evening. And so one thing I would like to do basically to just try to get a little bit of feedback from you guys, and just not necessarily for me, but also for the entire group, see what you guys are seeing in your production system and in your region. I just put in the chat there a link. If you click on that, you can participate. It's just a quick poll here looking at common nitrogen losses that you may see in your area. What do you think is perhaps the main challenge for you? We have things like leaching, perhaps, volatilization losses. You think you have issues with tie-up, denitrification, or perhaps you think that nitrogen loss not a big issue. And again, that could be the case for many of you out west, for example, right? And so if you can please put some, I see some of you also participating via the chat. I see some of you putting B, volatilization in the chat. Very good. I really appreciate that. It's, again, like I say, it's really just, you know, if we are in person, typically what we're going to be doing is show of hands and guys sharing a little bit what you guys are seeing. But again, this is one way to do this virtually, I guess. Very good. Denitrification. I see a lot of the denitrification. And again, if you are in eastern, southeast part of the state, of course, it's tend to be one of the main challenges. So I can see that being one of the main issues. A lot of you also seeing leaching problems potentially, or that's at least one of the main concerns you're looking at. Okay, very good. Okay, we'll stop there. Like I say, the idea was really just to see what you guys are seeing, or what are some of the main concerns when it comes to potential nitrogen losses. Okay, so to start here, one of the things I wanted to review a little bit, and this is a review, of course, for many of you, but a lot of when it comes to nitrogen and nitrogen losses in general, usually go back to this issue of changes in mineral nitrogen, specifically the nitrification, right? Changes from ammonium to nitrate. And see, this is a key concept, and of course is driven by soil temperature. It's a microbial process, so we need to have oxygen and temperature for that to happen. And I put nitrate here in red because this is usually the form of nitrogen that's problematic. Some of you there indicated leaching, denitrification. We need to have nitrate for this to happen, okay? And oftentimes, you know, when we're putting, of course, urea or anhydrous, we basically start with ammonium. So anything we do oftentimes has to go back to trying to delay this nitrification process and trying to keep that nitrogen in the ammonium form the longest possible to basically keep it stable in the soil. So this is important. And again, we'll go back to this, but look at temperature. We need to have oxygen. It's a microbial driven process, so it is important to keep that in mind. Some of you mentioned denitrification being a big problem, and I agree. In parts of the state, that's especially some of our corn producing regions, denitrification could be a big problem. And again, we have the nitrate there. We really need to have nitrate for this process to happen, but we also need to have typically higher temperatures in the soil. Okay? And we're talking 75 degrees at least. And so it's a process that obviously will tend to happen mostly in the summertime because of that need of higher temperatures. And so again, keep that in mind, again, as we're thinking about potential losses and what basically needs to be there in the soil for that loss to happen. Again, nitrate is going to be more problematic. That's basically what's going to be subject to leaching, denitrification. And when it comes to managing nitrogen, what we typically want is to keep that nitrogen in the ammonium form as much as we can. Okay, so we're playing with time of application, sources, inhibitors. We're basically trying to keep most of that nitrogen in the ammonium form. So that's basically stable, and it's going to be there. Hopefully, we're not going to lose much of that nitrogen. So that's the key point there. And so this is one study we've been doing for the last 4 years, and just to put a little bit in perspective, kind of what we tend to see with things like nitrification inhibitor. And this is N-Serve, which is a product that's been around for many years now. There are some new ones that actually has some pretty good results as well. And this is one example of one study that we're doing with anhydrous. This is spring anhydrous applications. So we're doing this usually early March, 150 pounds. And basically, we have Ashland and Rossville primarily over the years. So a little bit more of a coarse texture soil, a situation where we may expect to have some leaching if we have some wet years. So what are we seeing? And so again, 4 years, 17, 18, 19, and 20, with and without inhibitors. The 150 plus is basically with the inhibitor. And as you can see, out of 8 site years, 5 of them basically we didn't see any difference. Okay? So where we basically saw the difference was in 2019 at both locations, and also last year in Ashland we saw a little bit of a benefit from the use of inhibitors with anhydrous. And so again, this is very common, very typical type of data that we see with the use of inhibitors. Oftentimes depends on the year. And of course, if we didn't have 2019, and you guys remember 2019 was much wetter in parts of the state. And so we did have some potential losses in many cases. Again, if we didn't have 19, obviously it's likely that we will see much less response to inhibitors. So that's very typical of what we tend to see with the use of nitrification inhibitors. And a lot of it goes back again, do we have the potential for losing that nitrogen or not? And again, you guys are gonna have to basically evaluate your specific situation. Do you have a condition where you have more coarse texture soils that maybe will be subject to leaching? Those will be candidates. Those of you who are in the southeast part of the state, weather conditions, heavy clay, water standing in the field, those are situations where we may have some potential losses. So again, the use of inhibitors could be more important in that kind of situation. So we basically have to evaluate each situation separately and see where we're gonna get the most benefit. Those of you out in central and western Kansas, very unlikely will get a benefit. And again, some of you already indicated, maybe not a big concern in some of those environments. And I completely agree with that. And again, that's where it comes to some of these products, and whether or not we need it is a key thing we have to keep in mind. Another way to look at this as well, we look at nitrogen use efficiency, and we talk a lot about nitrogen use efficiency. And obviously we want to be more efficient, both from the agronomic and environmental side. This is data from last year, 2020. In Ashland, we saw an increase in nitrogen use efficiency with the use of inhibitors. In Rossville, we didn't see a yield increase. And obviously that didn't translate into an increase in nitrogen use efficiency either. And this was really measuring total nitrogen uptake in the plant. So it's really also the overall efficiency in terms of how much nitrogen the corn is taking out. And so that's one way to measure that as well, not just yields. And so again, one other way to look at this, the use of inhibitors. The other thing is, and we did very intensive sampling in this project. We look at soil tests collected basically during the growing season. We start in V2 corn, and we basically finish at black layer R6. And so we measure how much nitrate we have in that soil. And so the red line here is basically the straight 150 pounds of nitrogen. The green line is the same rate, 150 plus the inhibitor. And then we have the check here. And very clearly, on this average of 4 locations, very clearly, we were basically able to measure less nitrate when we're using these inhibitors. And so this means basically that the inhibitor is doing what's supposed to do. Okay, it's basically keeping most of that nitrogen in the ammonium form, okay, which is what we want. We want to have more stable form of nitrogen. So stay more in the ammonium form, and the nitrate is basically keeping it low. Okay. Now, will that be equivalent to a yield increase? And we already saw that. Not necessarily, because yes, we may have less nitrate, but if we don't have any losses, it doesn't really matter, right? And so again, it goes back to those conditions, soil conditions and environmental conditions, to really see a difference here. But it's good to see also from the soil standpoint that some of these products is actually doing what's supposed to do, and basically be ready for whether we have conditions for nitrogen losses. One thing I want to point out here, obviously, as we get to V8 or so, you have a big decrease here in soil nitrogen, soil nitrate, and obviously you know what's happening at V8. That corn starts to grow pretty aggressively, take up a lot of nitrogen, and of course, that's reflected in the soil as well. Okay, so we talk a lot about temperature and moisture, and one thing I wanted to put a little bit in perspective, I know I always see many of you probably doing fall anhydrous application, which obviously could be very attractive and can work pretty well in many of our soils. But there's always the question, what's happening during the winter months and early spring? Are we losing some of that nitrogen or not? And this is just a quick, I pulled this just before I got here, looking at temperature, soil temperature. This is from Manhattan. This is from the Mesonet. You can get the same information from the Mesonet website for your particular location. But what we have here is soil temperature, which is pretty much, straight line here, right below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? So the soil temperature is pretty stable there. And then we have air temperature, okay? That's going up and down here. And as you can see, pretty nice the last few days. I mean, it's hard to believe we are in January. But today, we basically get to 60 degrees here in Manhattan. But look at the soil temperature. It changed a little bit. We're talking maybe 1 or 2 degrees at that 4 inches, and still staying below that 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So even though the earth temperature goes up, the change in soil temperature is much less. So we have to keep that in mind. Just because we have some of these warm days, hopefully our soil temperature stay low, which is good. Again, if we did it in fall anhydrous, this is what we want to see. We want to keep that temperature in the soil, hopefully lower during these months. And so again, just wanted to emphasize this because, oftentimes we kind of thinking air temperature versus soil temperature, and what we need to be looking at is soil temperature, okay? That's really the value that we need to pay attention to, and we can get this information from the Mesonet pretty easily. So this is again just also this from today. This is 7-day average temperature across the state. You can kind of take a look in the southern part. We are approaching 40, but for the most part, we are basically way below that 40 degrees in average in the last 7 days, which is good. And so again, drier conditions, low soil temperature, obviously chances to lose nitrogen that you perhaps already applied last fall, I would say pretty low at this point for most of the state. Okay, so a few key drivers for nitrogen loss and nitrogen use efficiency. Assuming that, of course, we take care of the rates, we're putting that according to the yield potential and whatever we have in the soil already. I always say placement is a key factor. And those of you who are managing no-till systems, placement becomes really a critical factor. And there's going to be several things that could be a risk. If we're doing broadcast on top, for example, on heavy residue situation, we can have some volatilization problems. And so we really want to inject that nitrogen below the residue So again, no-till systems in particular, placement will tend to be your key factor for improving that efficiency. Time of application as well. Those of you maybe with dealing a little bit more of a sandier soil, coarse texture soil, closer to planting time or even side dress will always tend to be more efficient if we're pulling too early. So to me, these two key factors are really the ones that I like to look and try to improve those when it comes to nitrogen management in general. Those tend to be the main for most of our situations. And again, especially no-till systems in particular. And so we always talk a lot about additives. What about different sources? And yes, there's obviously a role for that. But again, that depends a lot on what specific soils and conditions in many situations may not make a difference. And again, that's where we're talking, those of you out Western Kansas, for example, you really have more flexibility. You can use different sources as long as you are injecting that fertilizer, potential for leaching and things like that is really not a concern. And so again, those are a little bit more kind of specific depending on what kind of situations you have, what kind of soils you have. But placement and time are two key factors that we need to pay attention to for nitrogen management. Those are usually the ones that tends to make the most difference in terms of nitrogen use. Okay, so we'll switch gears here a little bit. We'll like to share with you something on potassium that we've been doing this year. It's a little bit different situation, and you know, I often get this situation where, and this is exactly what happened this spring, that somebody call and say, well, we have the corn looking yellow, we do have some potassium deficiency show up, what can we do? And so it's a little bit different. We know potassium is immobile. We want to apply ideally before planting. But what happens if we already have an issue of deficiency? Can we do some type of rescue application? And this is more of an issue for you guys out in the eastern part of the state. This was central Kansas, and so it's where we do have more problems with potassium. This particular field we have below the critical level, 82 parts per million. We basically came in and applied 50 pounds of K2O podcast at B8.
I think I'll pass.
And so this is a little bit of the pictures. This is 22 days after application, okay, the control. And then we have the 50 pounds of K2O. And this is dry fertilizer broadcast. You can already see right away there's a difference. Still plenty of deficiencies they're showing, but it's definitely growing much better. And at 48 days after application, you can really see the difference there. But again, very severe potassium deficiency issue. You can see the deficiency leaves basically showing up in the tops, which is very unusual for corn potassium deficiency, which usually is in the lower leaves, right? And so it is a deficient, very deficient situation here. What happened later in the season, and here we have 62 days after application. You can really see the difference in growth stages, basically go ahead and much bigger plants, but still showing some of that deficiency symptom. In a black layer, again, big difference there in plant growth in general, okay? And so what happened in terms of yields? And we saw about over 11 bushel yield increase in this case. And so you can do the numbers and think about this some, you know, as a rescue option. Is this something that we can do? Obviously, there are some key factors here. Moisture and things like that is going to be a driving factor. But we do get some, we got some benefit, some yield response here, which certainly will, especially with the better grain prices, will pay for that 50 pounds of K2O. Now, this was dry fertilizer. There are some options for liquid, you know, if you're going to be, for example, already doing some side dress liquid, UAN, for example, there are some KTS, for example, an option of potassium that can be applied with liquid ammonium potassium acetate source that also liquid that can be applied in combination. So a few options, a little bit more expensive. In our case, we just went with the dry, which is what we have on hand and typically more available. And so in general, side dress potassium, we basically saw that there was a benefit there in terms of yield and increase in K uptake. So it is one alternative. Like I say, moisture is one factor that we have to pay attention to that. We need to get that rainfall to incorporate that K a little bit, unless again, we can do some type of liquid and maybe even inject sidedress. That's also a possibility that can perhaps help us there. The one thing I want to emphasize is that yield response is much smaller compared to pre-plant. So it's really more of a rescue application option. That's the only reason, the only way I will suggest this. Ideally, obviously, you want to take care of this pre-plan, make sure based on soil tests, everything. But again, I often see this. We already planted the corn. We didn't see that. If we have deficiency, is there anything we can do with that? And again, this gives us some ideas, some options from that standpoint. Other things also when it comes to soil testing for potassium, and this goes a little bit for phosphorus also. One thing that I saw quite a bit this year is some of the numbers for P and K and even pH that came up a little bit unusual this fall. And so what happened this fall? Put it dry. A lot of guys harvest obviously early. We didn't have any issues there. But also when it comes especially to potassium, we do have variability in season. And one of the main things in potassium is that we do have quite a bit of potassium that usually leach back from the biomass and goes back to the soil. So what happened if we, again, a year like this, where we have pretty dry, early fall, pretty much all, well, it's still pretty dry, not much chances for that potassium to cycle back and get back to the soil. So soil samples we are collecting oftentimes coming back pretty low in K. That means that we need to apply fertilizer K. In many situations, maybe not, because again, a lot of that K that's in the residue will leach back and will be back there available to the crop. And so I guess the point in this situation is that we need to be looking at and putting things a little bit in perspective, historical data, what kind of values we typically see in some of our fields. And like I say, that also goes for a little bit for phosphorus and also for pH. pH will also tend to be a little bit lower if we have very dry soils. And like I say, we did have some of that situation in samples that I saw this fall. And so there's something to pay attention to that. When you're reading some of your soil samples, especially again with K and pH. Critical value, 130 part per million, we always have to keep that in mind as well. Okay, so switching here quickly to pH and the focus of this, I wanted to focus primarily on no-till systems. And this is something that I hear more and more from central and western part of the state, which is unusual. I know you guys deal more with high pH typically, but it is interesting situation. We are starting to see a little bit more of that in no-till systems. And this is one example, this one field actually in Southwest Kansas. And I think what I see, at least in my case, is that I tend to see a lot more guys realizing there are some low pH spots in fields when they do grit sampling. So say, for example, guys who've been doing a composite sample for years and you know, average pH coming back, you know, okay, maybe a little bit low, but really not really bad. And then once you go and do grit sampling, you realize you have some parts of the field that are actually getting pretty low, okay? And so potentially we'll be needing some lime application in that case. Again, a lot of this is no-till, so we're not mixing the soil. Of course, we know that we're gonna have more alkaline, neutral, and alkaline soil in the subsoil. So a lot of these gonna be in the upper, you know, 2 inches, 3 inches. That's really where we tend to see most of the problem. But again, a lot of this seems to go back to just more now finding out basically with grit sampling some of these challenges. And so this is something we did at 2 locations. This is in north central Kansas, in 2 locations with this kind of situation. And what we see here is different rates of lime. We have a 0.5 ton, 1 ton, and 3 tons of effective calcium carbonate lime application on top, on the surface. Basically no incorporation. This is no-till, so we are not doing any of that. And so this is the change in pH that we're seeing, okay? And so with the high rate, we are seeing an increase in pH of up to about 2 units, okay? So 2 units increase. A lot of these were a little bit below 5, so we were approaching basically pH of 7 by the time we collect these, which was 3 years after the lime application, okay? And so basically follow pretty nicely the rates. And again, about 2 pH units with the high rates, with the 1 ton, basically about one pH unit. But the main thing is, of course, that change happened primarily in the upper 3 inches. So that's really where we are affecting that pH with the surface lime application in no-till, which is fine in most cases. Again, if we're talking central and western Kansas, we are not going to have acidic subsoil. So this is really the area where we're focusing on primarily for lime application. So I think it's sufficient in many of our situations. Now, what happened to yields? And I think this is the key here. This the average of the locations that we have. And basically 3 crops. The rotation there was wheat and then corn and followed soybean. And so the line was applied in the summer before we drilled the wheat, and then basically followed the rotation. And so you can see basically didn't see any response with the wheat. Obviously, it's a crop that tends to be more tolerant to low pH, so that may be part of the factor there. And then in terms of corn, we basically saw a small increase, basically with the first half ton. We basically captured the yield already. Soybean, we need a little bit more, but also in terms of yield increase, is not huge. And this is always a question I get is, okay, will this pay? And again, it's a fair question. Lime, of course, is very expensive, especially as we go central and western Kansas, and it's a challenge. It's a small yield increase. However, one thing I want to put in perspective is that when it comes to lime, we have to look at the economics a little bit different. I don't think we need to do anything on these fields maybe until 8, 10, 15 years in some cases. Okay? So it will take a lot of time. So the economics is a little bit different. We need to be looking at multiple crops here, basically to look at that combined effect. Okay, so that's basically what we saw. Again, small increases, but we'll look at that in a multi-year context. We need to look at the economics of lime a little bit differently. And again, that's just the way it is with lime. And unfortunately, it's a little bit different and sometimes a little challenge because of that. We have to look at that multi-year. We only basically able to change pH in the upper 3 inches, which again, in most of our situations in no-till, that's probably all we need really. And I think it's sufficient, especially some of our alkaline and neutral subsoils that we have in central and western Kansas. There are also other factors that comes with fixing that pH, right? What about chemicals, herbicides? What about water infiltration and things like that? It's a little bit more difficult to measure those, but there are some of those benefits as well. In terms of target pH, typically we say we want to keep at least 6 or higher. Typically, we start to see problems once you get to pH below 5.5 and start to see aluminum in solution. That's where we start to see some problems with root development, nutrient availability, and uptake. So we have to keep those things in mind, basically, as we are kind of monitoring and, of course, playing a little bit with economics, especially because, again, this is a long-term consideration pretty much. One of the main things I want to emphasize is variable rate. We pretty much have to do variable rate. If we go back and look at some of these maps, you can easily be over applying in some parts and you're going to be short in others if we are doing a uniform application. So when we talk about lime, in my opinion, I think it has to be variable rate. I think is really the only way to go, both from the economic standpoint, but also from the agronomic, because we don't want to over apply either, especially in no-till systems. That's one key factor there. And so just to finish here and go to the next presentation, wanted to just, I didn't talk much about phosphorus today. Like I say, want to keep this presentation a little bit shorter and go to some of the questions later. But of course, phosphorus and micronutrients, those could be a key factor. Soil tests, we need to rely pretty much on that for, especially for phosphorus management. Starter fertilizer with phosphorus, always a key factor for corn. Corn is definitely the crop that can respond the best to starter fertilizer, especially no-till systems. And so again, some phosphorus, also great opportunity to be putting some micros. I have the next point here is sulfur. It's becoming a little bit more of a challenge. Depending on where you are, what kind of soils you have, sulfur is also becoming a challenge. So we need, I know many guys pretty much include sulfur as part of their program, and which is in many cases maybe makes sense, right? We don't need a lot, which is a good thing. So it's easily applied in combination with starter fertilizers, or maybe just in combination with other dry fertilizers. So again, something that we need to watch for. So far, I've seen more of the deficiency issues in wheat, but more and more starting to show up in corn as well. So I will expect that will continue And so we just need to keep that in mind. And of course, pH is something to pay attention to that. Those of you who deal with low pH, and like I say, I know there's a little bit more different management, different input that, putting the trigger on lime is always a little more difficult. But again, it is something that will affect availability, nutrient uptake, and growth. And so we need to look at that very closely as well. And so with that, I will stop here and we'll start switching to Ignacio and then start with the questions.
Okay, I think we're switched over. Thank you so much, Dorivar here. There was two that came in through the chat, and I can just read them here, and Dorivar is sitting right here next to me, so he can that. So the first one is, Dorivar, is there any research on nitrogen-charged biochar on retaining nitrogen in the soil?
It's a good question. We don't have any research on that specifically. One of the key things to keep in mind is that with the biochar, you're basically talking about the charge of the soil and potentially helping to keep that nitrogen in place. And so for that, you basically need to have positive charge nitrogen, which is ammonium. So we kind of go back to that point of, as long as you're keeping that nitrogen in the ammonium form, that by itself is already helping you. So some of these products can maybe help, especially maybe in sandier soils, but for the most part, we do have enough charge in the soils that I rarely will tend to see any big impact from that type of products.
Got it. And the other question that's came in the chat is, wanted to know how much lime to apply on irrigated cornfields to cover big nitrogen application rates when you're at 260 to 300 is what they said.
Yes, that's a very good point. High application rates, we typically, what we're going to say that in no-till is, first of all, cut in half at least. And in many cases, you need to lower that rate even more. So I will not go with the full rate, recommended rate. Oftentimes, we need to lower that. And I typically will not go more with maximum for sure, no more than 2 or 3 tons. That would be the maximum for sure. And then in many cases, go back and retest and see where we are after a couple of years. And like I say, no-till in particular, remember, we're only basically affecting that top 3 inches. So that would be a big factor. So we need to pay attention to that. It's an excellent question because that could be an issue. If we go with the full rate, we may actually over-apply lime.
Okay. That is good. That's all the questions for Dorivar that was up. Looks like we have one more. Yeah, just a kind of a comment. Pelleted lime probably won't last as long as ag lime. How soon after applying pelleted lime should we be concerned with needing lime again for the different products?
Yes, that's a very good question as well. And pellet lime is really more of a high quality lime generally. And so when it comes to effective calcium carbonate, we have a much higher percent, typically 85, 90% compared to regular lime. And in terms of the reaction time, yes, it will react faster. But in terms of the time frame that we're looking at here, we're talking 3 or 5 or 10 years. I don't think that will make a big difference because the initial reaction tends to happen in about 2 or 3 months, depending on moisture. But regardless of the lime source, in about 2 or 3 months, all of that reaction happens, and the soil is basically stable at that point. Essentially, anything that's going to react happens within that 3 months.
Got it. I think that is all in the chat. Is there any other questions that anyone wants to just ask? Just feel free to unmute your microphone and go ahead and ask. Okay. Well, seeing none, thanks again, Dorivar. I guess we have virtual hands clapping or whatever. So